Lisa was a wealthy woman, heiress to a vast fortune left to her by her late husband. After years of mourning and dedicating herself to her son, Tommy, she finally decided to marry again. Her new fiancé, Greg, was charming and attentive, and her family and friends were delighted that she had found a new partner. However, 10-year-old Tommy started noticing strange behaviors in Greg, especially when they were alone. Something felt off, and he decided to investigate on his own. With the wedding approaching, Tommy felt the pressure to reveal the truth before it was too late. Tommy sat on the stairs, watching Greg enter the room with that smile that made everyone around believe he was an amazing guy. Ever since his mom, Lisa, had started dating Greg, everyone seemed captivated by him. He was always so polite, bringing flowers for his mom and gifts for Tommy. Real prince, as Lisa's friends would say. But to Tommy, something didn't add up. There was something in Greg's words and looks when they were alone that made him uneasy. One time, when Lisa left the room for a few minutes, Tommy and Greg were alone. In that moment, Greg gave Tommy a cold, impersonal look. "You need to learn to respect me, kid," he said in a low, threatening tone that made Tommy shrink back. The authoritative tone and the way Greg treated him when no one else was around didn't match his affectionate behavior in front of Lisa. Tommy tried to talk to his mom about Greg's behavior, but Lisa was so happy that she thought he was just jealous. "Tommy, Greg is a good man," she would say with a big smile. "You just need to give him a chance." But deep down, Tommy knew his suspicions weren't baseless. As the days went by and the wedding drew closer, Greg seemed increasingly interested in the details of Lisa's finances. One night at dinner, he casually asked about the money left by Tommy's late father, wanting to know if it was all safe and how Lisa planned to handle it after the wedding. This made Tommy's stomach turn. He was certain Greg wasn't who he pretended to be. With no one to confide in, Tommy began watching his future stepfather even more closely. He knew he had to protect his mom somehow. But how? Greg was clever. He knew how to hide his intentions and manipulate situations to his advantage. Yet, Tommy resolved that, if necessary, he would expose everything he knew, even if no one believed him. Tommy started overhearing Greg's phone conversations, especially late at night. Once, as he walked past the office where Greg was, he heard him mention inheritance and access to assets. This made his heart race. Who, after all, talked about access to assets so casually? That night, Tommy struggled to sleep. He tossed and turned, wondering if he was imagining things, or if there was truly something sinister behind Greg's intentions. Finally, he decided he needed concrete evidence to convince his mom. So, the next night, he hid in the hallway near the office, waiting for Greg to start another one of his conversations. It didn't take long before Greg made another mysterious call. Hidden, Tommy heard Greg say in a dark tone, "Once the wedding's over, everything will be in my name. Lisa won't suspect a thing." Greg's words hit Tommy like a weight on his chest. He no longer had any doubts. Greg planned to marry his mother to take her fortune and, who knows, maybe even get rid of her. In the days that followed, Greg continued to act hostile and cold whenever they were alone. In one of those moments, he even threatened Tommy, saying that once he married Lisa, he'd be the one in charge of the house. "Then you'll learn to stay in your place," Greg whispered. That threat didn't intimidate Tommy. Instead, it made him even more determined to act quickly. He knew the wedding was soon, and time was against him. Tommy was scared, but he was also resolute. Everything was clear now. He needed to tell his mom, and the only moment she would really listen was on the wedding day, when everyone would be there to hear the truth about Greg. Tommy was determined to tell his mom everything he knew before the wedding. He knew that Lisa was completely wrapped up in the preparations and the idea of starting a new life with Greg, but he couldn't wait any longer. Over breakfast, he took a deep breath and, summoning his courage, began to speak. "Mom, we need to talk about Greg," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Lisa, distracted as she organized the final guest list, just smiled at him, shaking her head. "Tommy, I know you're jealous. It's normal, you know? This is a big change for both of us." He pressed on, explaining that he had overheard Greg talking about the inheritance and his plans for it. But Lisa seemed not to really listen. She shook her head, running her hand affectionately over his hair. "Honey, he's just concerned about how we'll manage financially after the wedding. You know he only wants the best for us." Frustrated, Tommy tried again. "No, Mom, he's dangerous. I heard him saying horrible things. He only wants your money." Lisa sighed, looking at her son with a mix of exhaustion and a little compassion. "Tommy, I know this is hard for you to accept. I understand. But I need you to trust me, sweetheart. Greg makes me very happy. Everything's going to be fine. You'll see." Hearing that, Tommy felt a tightness in his chest. He knew Lisa was making a mistake, but he realized she was somehow blinded by Greg and the promises he made. It was as if she was in a dream, unable to see what was really happening around her. Tommy left the room feeling more alone than ever. He knew that if he didn't act, Greg would destroy everything. And with the wedding fast approaching, he realized the only time left to tell the truth was on the day of the ceremony itself. Despite his fear of hurting his mom and ruining her special day, he decided it was the only way to save Lisa and himself from Greg's dark intentions. The long-awaited wedding day had arrived. The garden was adorned with flowers, and the guests, all smiling, eagerly awaited the moment when Lisa and Greg would exchange vows. But while everyone else was radiant, Tommy felt a mix of tension and fear. He looked around, trying to summon the courage, wondering if he could really go through with what he had planned. When the time finally came and the guests grew silent, Tommy knew this was his moment. Heart pounding, he stepped up to the microphone. All eyes turned to him, and Lisa, smiling but slightly confused, seemed not to understand what was happening. "I need to talk about Greg," Tommy began, his voice trembling but determined. A murmur spread among the guests, and Lisa's smile faded. He looked directly at his mother and then revealed everything. How Greg treated him when they were alone, the threats he made, and the plan he'd overheard, where Greg intended to marry her just to steal her fortune and possibly even get rid of her. The silence that followed was absolute. Everyone present was stunned. Lisa seemed frozen, her eyes filling with tears, mouth slightly open. Greg, on the other hand, struggled to keep his composure but was visibly rattled. He shook his head, trying to deny everything, but Tommy stood firm, recounting each detail he had overheard. With each word, Tommy felt the tension in the room intensify. He looked at his mother, hoping that this time she would finally believe him. Lisa stayed motionless, processing everything, and the silence grew heavy, almost tangible, as Tommy's revelations echoed in everyone's minds. Lisa stared at Greg, the man she loved and trusted, trying to absorb everything she just heard. Tommy's words still lingered in the air, each one carrying a weight she could have never imagined. For the first time, she began to see Greg's gestures and words in a new light, as calculated and cruel. When Greg attempted to speak, stammering and trying to deny it all, she saw right through him. "Don't play the victim, Greg," she murmured, pulling Tommy close to her. She now understood the expression her son always had around Greg, and she felt a mix of anger and betrayal. Without a second thought, Lisa took out her phone and called 911. The ceremony, which was meant to be the beginning of a new life, had instead become the end of the relationship she had once dreamed of. The guests stepped back, some murmuring to each other, shocked by what they'd witnessed, while she informed the police of what had happened. Realizing he'd lost control of the situation, Greg dashed out, leaving the ceremony and the guests behind. Lisa embraced Tommy, feeling both devastated and relieved. Now she knew she could protect herself and her son from the man who had deceived her for so long. In the days that followed, Lisa and Tommy began to rebuild their lives. The bond between mother and son grew stronger than ever, and they promised always to look out for each other, above all else. Together, they were determined to leave that dark chapter in the past and move forward, knowing that their love and courage had saved them both.